The snow that had begun on the day of the fateful Quidditch match had yet to give up. The school grounds were like a winter wonderland, making for a magic, or at least a more magical backdrop for Slughorn's Christmas party. It was an event both Hermione and Harry had been looking forward to. After all, it was their first official date as well as their first public experience as a couple. Sure, there were plenty of rumors flying around the school about them. The only people who knew the truth were Gryffindors. The day of the party was actually pretty relaxed, as they'd finished their mid-year tests the day before. For those who were lucky enough to have an invitation to Slughorn's exclusive party, it seemed the perfect way to end the term. The train would be taking them home the next morning for the holiday. Most of the morning, Harry had been thwarting Romilda Vane's attempts to get him to ask her to Slughorn's party. He'd never seen a more determined person, well, unless it was McLaggen with Hermione. Finally, after forcing him to take a box of chocolate cauldrons, she finally gave up. Remembering what Hermione had told him about Romilda and her love potions, and that Mad Eye would have his for eating or drinking something he didn't know the origins of, he threw the box into the bottom of his trunk with the intentions of throwing them out or destroying them, whatever. While Hermione took her time getting ready, Harry was sitting at their usual spot in the common room along with Neville, Ron, and Dean. Even though Harry and Hermione were going together, they decided to use their extra invitations so that Ron and Lavender were able to go to the party as well. Exactly what are they doing that's taking so long? Dean asked in slight frustration. They'd all been in their dress robes for at least an hour and a half. Shortly after lunch, Hermione, Ginny, Lavender, and Luna had disappeared and still haven't been heard from. You shouldn't question it, never ever, Ron said. There are certain things about the rituals observed by the female gender that a man should never know anything about. Harry agreed with Ron. This one time I saw my gran wearing one of those green mask things, Neville said, the look in his eyes complete horror. I still have nightmares. The guys all shuddered. Nobody should ever witness that, Harry said. Hear, hear, Ron agreed. And what's the deal with those little cotton balls? I swear in the summer with Hermione and Ginny at the house they come out of the bathroom. There are millions of them littered all over the counter and they look like they've gone into battle. I know, right? Harry agreed. I mean, women say that men are slobs, but I beg to differ. I honestly think that Ron's school is much neater. And who needs that many pairs of shoes? Dean threw in. And the millions of cosmetic potions and hair potions, that pollute every amount of counter and cabinet space in every bathroom in the house, Ron said. My aunt and uncle have 3 daughters. One time I was there when he had to snake the drain and I'm pretty sure that he pulled a Wookiee out of it, Dean added. Harry busted out laughing, not just at the story but the bewildered look on Neville and Ron's faces. He put a snake in a drain? Ron asked, thoroughly confused. Bloody muggles are a weird lot. Dean shook his head and sighed and looked at Harry for help. I'm tapped. Muggles don't have magical means to unstop their plumbing, and so they take a really long wire and stick it down in the drain, and it has a hook on the end to pull out whatever is blocking it. It's called snaking a drain, he explained. Bloody barbaric is what it is, Ron said with a look of horror. What's a Wookiee? Neville asked. Wookiee, Dean corrected. He never got to explain because the girls took that moment to finally grace them with their presence. All of them looked stunning, even Luna with her eccentric style and metallic party dress. Harry could tell by the look on Neville's face that it wouldn't have mattered if Luna would have been wearing her radish earrings, her butterbeer cap necklaces, and her spectre specs. He'd still think she was beautiful, and Harry admired him for that. The one who really stood out, at least for him, was Hermione. He was sure that he'd never seen her look more beautiful, not even 2 years before when she went to the Yule Ball with Crumb. Of course that was the night he'd first realized she was actually a girl, but since then she'd truly blossomed. The dress that she wore that night was subtle. It was a pale blush of pink tea length that cut low but not too low in the front and in the back, showing just enough skin to keep you guessing. Harry walked over to where she was at and wrapped his arms around her, kissing her softly. "You look amazing," he said. Hermione smiled against his lips. "Thank you." "Oi, you two, we have a party to get to," Ron called to the couple. "Leave them alone, one," Lavender scolded playfully. Ron cringed at the pet name she'd given him that he truly hated. He knew that once they were back in the dorms he'd never hear the end of it. He was just grateful for the fact that Fred and George had left school the year before. If they ever heard that nickname, they'd never let him hear the end of it. Harry chuckled a little, wrapping his arm around Hermione. "We're coming," he assured Ron. By the time they made it to the party, it was in full swing. Slughorn had gone to a lot of trouble making sure that his office was exceptionally festive. The walls were draped in red and green, and the only light in the room came from the fairy lights dangling from the ceiling, giving the room an intimate feel and cast the room with almost a red aura. As soon as they were seen together, all sorts of stories started to spread through the crowd. The fact that Hermione Granger, super nerd, and Harry Potter were dating was just as interesting to them as the actual celebrities Slughorn had invited to the party. What was it with Hermione and talented seekers? When Harry saw the house elves circling the room carrying trays that were almost larger than themselves, he braced himself for the usual tirade about slavery and was shocked when it didn't happen. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked. "Why wouldn't I be?" Hermione looked confused. "The elves," he said. "Oh, that," she said. "I had decided that I would be on my best behavior tonight and not bring it up." "Who are you? What have you done with my Hermione?" he asked. She laughed. "Your Hermione?" she asked, running her hand up his arm, caressing it gently through the sleeve of his robes. He said, looking down at her. "Yes, my Hermione," he stressed the "my" part. "I like that," she said. "Me too," he agreed. "Would you like to dance?" "Now who's acting out of character?" she teased. "Well, it's a slow song, you can't really mess it up," he pointed out, leading her to the dance floor. Harry had never been one to dance. The Yule Ball, which he and the other Triwizard champions had to open with the first dance, had been a nightmare. In fact, Parvati Patil and her pajamas still gave him and Ron dirty looks and barely spoke to them, and it had been 2 years. This was different though. Hermione was different, and he knew that he would do anything to make her happy, even give her his firebolt. "So how do we do this again?" he asked, looking down at her. "Like this," she said, taking his hands and putting them on her narrow waist before sliding her hands up his chest and swaying with him to the song. In that moment Harry knew exactly what heaven felt like. It was Hermione in his arms. He leaned down and breathed in the sweet scent of her hair. His fingertips massaged circles in the smooth exposed skin of her back and pressed a kiss to her shoulder. Hermione's head leaned against Harry's chest and closed her eyes. She didn't care about anyone around them, what they were saying, what they thought for that matter. "Can we just stay like this?" she asked. Before he had a chance to answer her, the song ended and Slughorn swept Harry away to meet some of his esteemed guests. Hermione made her way over to the reference table where she bumped into McLaggen. She tried to get away without his notice, but it was too late. "Granger," he said in his arrogant "my shit doesn't stink" tone. "McLaggen," Hermione said socially as she went back to fixing her plate. "So you're here with Potter?" he said. Hermione raised an eyebrow. "Obviously," she said. "You know I had you pegged for one of those goody-type girls," he said. "You know, the kind who are too uptight to do anything fun." She sighed and gave him a bored look. "Does this have a point?" she asked. First crumb now Potter, you aiming to land every Quidditch player you come across, he asked. Hermione didn't know if she should be offended or laugh hysterically. As someone who couldn't even guard a goal, you should know that it couldn't possibly include you. I only like good Quidditch players. With that, Hermione turned to walk away, only to have McLaggen grab her by her arm and pull her back. Where are you going? I've not had my fill of you yet. Before Hermione had a chance to draw her wand, Harry was across the room and shoved McLaggen back into the refreshment table. What the bloody hell is your problem, Potter? He growled, pushing himself up from the rubble that was once a food-laden table. You're my problem, Harry said, pushing Hermione behind him protectively. You put your fucking hands on my girlfriend again, you will regret it. Nice job, McLaggen. Piss off the one person that not even you know who can kill, Ron said with a laugh. The rest of the party was just kind of in silent shock. Dueling in the corridors wasn't uncommon, though is technically forbidden. This was different. Sorry about your party, Professor, Harry said. Slughorn was still slack-jawed. It's quite all right, Harry M. boy. How about we go for some fresh air? Hermione asked Harry. He nodded, letting her pull her from the party while Ron and Neville repaired the table. As they walked into the hallway, which was significantly colder than the party, Harry pulled the jacket part of his robes off and wrapped it around Hermione's shoulders. Better? He asked. Hermione nodded, sliding her arms into the sleeves. The question is, are you all right? She asked. I don't think I've ever really been that angry before, not even at Umbridge or Snape or Fudge, Harry said. When he implied, he shook his head, still seething over it. Harry, he's jealous of you, she said, and stopped him before he had a chance to protest. Not just because of me, but because of who you are. You are everything that he wants to be. Harry shook his head. Nobody wants to be me, Hermione. Hell, I don't even want to be me most of the time, he said, wrapping his arm around her, pulling her to his side. You're wrong, she said. They would never admit it. Why though? Why would they want this life? He asked. From the outside it's adventurous, she said. The things that you've done just since you've been here at Hogwarts, that's more than some people do in 100 lifetimes. I would give anything to be like them, just a normal bloke whose mum and dad is still alive. I wish the only things that I had to worry about right now was Quidditch and studying and you, he said, cupping her cheek. I'm the one thing in your life that you don't have to worry about, Harry. I'm not going anywhere, I will always be here, she promised. Harry leaned down and claimed her lips in a long, slow kiss, his tongue sweeping slowly into her mouth, teasing hers. He'd never get enough of her sweet taste or the way her body felt pressed against his. He'd never known anyone as kind as she was, and sweet and pure. I love you, Harry, she said softly against his lips. Harry cupped her face in his hand and kissed her. His tongue sweeping slowly into her mouth, his hand sliding up her back to rest against her exposed skin, causing Hermione to moan softly into his lips. When he pulled back and rested his forehead against hers. You have no idea how much it means to hear you say that, he said. I love you, Harry Potter, she said again, wrapping her arms around his neck. Are the two of you going to stand there and snog all night? Ron called to them, his arm carelessly draped around Lavender's shoulder. Hermione's cheeks turned a faint pink and Harry laughed. You have no room to talk, Ronald, she scolded. The party is breaking up, mate, which means Filch and that damned cat of his will be on the alert. He already caught Malfoy trying to gate crash, Neville said. What? Harry asked, his curiosity prickled. Filch caught him sulking around the corridor, Ginny said. If you ask me, he was up to something more than trying to get into the party. I agree, Dean said. Ever since Ginny had come down the stairs earlier that night dressed up for the party, Dean had been very agreeable. In fact, Harry was pretty sure that if you were to ask him about his complaining about how long it had taken her to look that beautiful, he probably would have denied it. Hermione looked up at Harry. She knew what he was thinking. It's pretty much the same thing that he'd been thinking since their trip to Diagon Alley at the end of summer. She knew Harry was convinced that Malfoy was a Death Eater, and she agreed that there was defiantly something going on with him. Malfoy was still his usual brand of arrogant, but lately it had become all bravado. "Harry, just come back to the tower with us," she pleaded with him. "I am," he said, looking down at her. "I'll be there shortly. I have my cloak with me, I won't get caught." She sighed. She knew that there was nothing she could say or do to convince him not go chasing after Malfoy. "Just don't be too long," she said. Harry kissed her on the cheek before covering himself with the cloak. The sound of his footsteps on the stone floor were all that was left. The next morning came sooner than anyone could have wanted. Everyone was still tired from the party the night before. The story about Harry hitting McLaggen at the Christmas party was not only the topic of discussion, it had grown in tremendous, not to mention outrageous details. In fact, the most commonly accepted version was that McLaggen had publicly molested Hermione. Harry went into rage mode and beat McLaggen to the point of unconsciousness and was now in the hospital wing. Another tall tale was that he'd used the Cruciatus Curse repeatedly on McLaggen for even looking at Hermione. But because the Cruciatus Curse was illegal to use and Harry was obviously not in Azkaban, they knew it couldn't possibly be true. Both stories died down when everyone saw that McLaggen was still in one piece, though a bit bruised, but obviously held a grudge for Harry. Once they were on the train, Harry, Hermione, and Ron found a vacant compartment. They hadn't had a chance to talk to Harry about what Malfoy had been doing the night before, as Lavender, Dean, and Ginny had still been up when he'd made it back to the common room. Both Hermione and Ron were dying to know what was going on. He waited for things to settle down on the train before he launched into the story. More than that last thing, he wanted was to be overheard, especially with the information he knew, that Snape had offered to help Malfoy do whatever it was Voldemort had charged him with. After listening to everything Harry told them, Ron was the first to speak. "Did you ever think that maybe Snape was trying to get Malfoy to confide in him?" Hermione was surprised at Ron. "You're the one who's always ready to sell Snape out." "What's gotten into you?" she asked. "Well, Dumbledore trusts Snape," he said sheepishly. "When Harry thought you know who had Sirius in the Department of Mysteries, he did call the order." "Dumbledore can make mistakes," Harry said. "He's told me as much." "We still don't have any proof though, Harry," Hermione said, sliding her hand into his and squeezing it gently. She wanted to back him up on this, but so far she wasn't sure what to believe. "I'm telling you, Malfoy is a Death Eater and Snape is helping him." "I don't need to prove I know," Harry said. "But why Malfoy?" Hermione asked. "He has plenty of wizards fully trained up at his disposal. Why would he need a kid?" "Why would the Order need me?" Harry countered, his tone defensive. "You're grabbing straws, mate," Ron said. "Malfoy's just a normal bloke, albeit a normal bloke who does tend to fall on the creepy side and happens to come from a long line of evil, Sirius excluded," he amended before Harry had a chance to defend his godfather. "Maybe he needs someone inside of Hogwarts to give him information," Harry said. "Well, he has Snape, or at least thinks he has," Hermione replied. "Well, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck dash." "It's not a Death Eater," Ron cut him off. "What's the unbreakable vow?" Harry asked, remembering the piece of information he'd forgot to share. "It's a promise sealed by magic," Hermione said. "Why?" "Snape said he made one with Malfoy's mother," Harry replied. "Are you sure he said the unbreakable vow?" Ron asked. The tone of his voice carried an almost frightened edge. Harry nodded. Why? Well, you can't break an unbreakable vow, Ron said. I kinda got that from the name. What happens if you do? There was a pregnant pause before Hermione finally answered, you die. By the time the Hogwarts Express made it back to London, the snow had started falling again. Molly Weasley, along Fred and George and a few other members of the Order, was waiting on the platform. Harry wrapped his arm around Hermione as they climbed off of the train. The holiday, though it had just begun, it had already started off promising. Right in front of Fred and George, Lavender gave Ron a tear-filled goodbye and went as far as to call him one in front of the twins. Before they'd left King's Cross Station, the ribbing had only just begun. The whole way back to the Burrow, Ron's face never faded from that nice magenta color that it turned when he was embarrassed, upset, or angry. Harry was pretty sure that he was all of the above. The fact that Fred and George knew it only made matters worse. Mrs. Weasley was still in a state over the fact that Bill had invited Fleur for Christmas. The two women seemed to butt heads every time they turned around. Once they were back at the Burrow, Harry and Ron headed up to Ron's room to unpack and tidy up before dinner. It was then that Harry realized that there was more upsetting Ron than the fact that Lavender called him the dreaded one in front of his older brothers. When Harry asked him what was wrong, everything spilled forth like a loose girl at a Sunday confession. He'd had so many things bottled up that he couldn't possibly say in front of Hermione. Even though she was one of his best mates, there were some things that were far too embarrassing to talk about with a female present. That girl is going to be the death of me, Harry, Ron said, sitting down on his bed and raking his hand through his ginger hair. I don't think George and Fred will take things that far, Harry offered. Who said anything about Fred and George? He asked, his voice squeaking slightly as he became even more emotional. Well, she did call you, you know, the name in front of them, Harry said. Oh, this has nothing to do with that, he replied dismissively. Then what does it have to do with? Harry was now very confused. Ron started pacing. Last night after you and Hermione went to bed, Lav and I were still up, Ron started. We decided to go skinny dipping in the prefect's bathroom. Well, it's a bathtub, wouldn't that mean you snuck in to take a bath? Harry offered honestly. He wasn't sure how much of the story he wanted to hear. There were things you never wanted to know about your best mate and his girlfriend, and this was very close to crossing that boundary. Well, it's a bit like a pool. The more Ron spoke, the more the redder his face became. He cleared his throat. Did you and Cho ever? I don't think this appropriate conversation, Harry said, becoming even more uncomfortable. Maybe you should talk to Bill or Charlie. That's a great idea. Bill's shaking up with the most attractive female ever. And the only females Charlie talks about are scaly and fire-breathing, Ron said. I can't talk to my brothers about this, Harry sighed. Once in the room of requirement after a DA meeting, he said, but refused to go into details. Well, Lav and I were ... and I am telling you, Harry, I was ... right there, he said, emphasizing each word. Congratulations, Harry offered, not sure what else to say. No, there is no congratulations. Before I could get any further, she pushes me back and asks me if I love her. And I wasn't sure what to say. I just sat there naked as the day I was born, staring at her. By this point, Harry was trying not to laugh at the situation. On top of that, the Ron's voice kept rising the longer the tale went on. What did she do? She kept asking, and I was trying to think of something to say. Finally I said I needed to think about it, and she got out of the water, got dressed and left. She said she couldn't do that with anyone who didn't love her and want to marry her. I'm only 16, Harry. Nobody knows who they want to marry when they're 16. Well, you're almost 17. Ron shot Harry an evil look. Is that the reason she was weepy? He changed the subject. You're not supposed to defend her. Ron snapped. It wouldn't go down, Harry, and I was in so much pain I had to crawl back to the Gryffindor tower. I thought I was going to die. I've not been in that much pain since that life-sucking brain in the Department of Mysteries. You know, I think it could have more damage than that bloody whomping willow tree. By the time Ron finished his tale, Harry was laughing so hard tears were in his eyes. Well, you just started dating the girl. You should have known better than to try to steal her charms. This is not even funny, and you just started dating Cho when you slept with her. Ron pointed out. Yeah, but Cho wasn't Lavender. Cho was looking for any way to ease the pain she felt after Cedric died. And what were you, the shoulder she cried on? He asked. No, it wasn't like that. Harry said, not even sure where to begin and couldn't bring himself to betray her like that. Besides, Cho and Lavender aren't the same people. Lavender he's a hopeless romantic. I'm sure she didn't envision her first time being a few minutes stolen in a bathroom where anyone could catch you. Since when did you get all this insight to girls? Ron asked. Harry shrugged. It's not insight, I just pay attention. Hell, if you would have listened to half of the stuff Hermione has told us over the years, you might not have ended up in this situation. Ron didn't have any more time to ponder on the subject as his mother called them all to dinner. Harry had always loved the Burrow, and meal times were usually the most interesting parts of his visits. Even better was the warmness that he felt when Hermione reached for his hand under the table and looked over at him and smiled. They listened to Fred and George give them details about how business was going at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes and their latest line of jokes and what have you. At the other end of the table, Fleur was going on about wedding details while Ginny made faces behind her back, making it hard for Hermione to keep a straight face while Mrs. Weasley complained about the length of Bill's hair. After dessert was finished and the dishes washed and put away, Harry grabbed his and Hermione's coats off of the coat rack. Come on, he said to Hermione. Where are we going? She asked, knowing that per Dumbledore's orders Harry wasn't supposed to go off too far without a guard from the order. It's a surprise, he said, helping her into her coat before pulling his own on. Bundle up, it will be cold. Not a chance you're going to tell me what we're doing, she asked, buttoning the buttons on her coat. None, he assured her as he tied her scarf around her neck and used it to pull her into a soft kiss. Gloves and hat too. After they were dressed for the weather, Harry led Hermione out into the crisp evening air. The sun had just barely started to set and was casting long shadows over the Burrow. The snow was still coming down in large flakes. Wait here, Harry said, walking towards one of the storage sheds. What are you doing, Harry Potter? She asked, watching him warily. It's a surprise, he said, pulling out his firebolt and walking over to her. Hermione shook her head. I am not getting on that thing, she said. Harry grinned. He knew that Hermione had never mastered flying. After all, it wasn't something you could learn in a book. Yes, you are. You're barking if you think I am, she protested. Why does flying scare you so much? He asked. Flying doesn't scare me, she said bravely, even though at the moment the thought was terrifying. I have seen you on that thing, I know exactly how fast it goes, and I have seen the crazy things you have done on it. Do you trust me, Hermione? He asked, taking her hand in his. Do you even have to ask that? She countered as she looked up at him. Just answer the question, he said. More than anything, she said. Then fly with me. I won't take you up too high or too fast or do anything crazy, he assured her. I give you my word I won't do anything you won't like. You won't let up about this, will you? She asked. He shook his head and grinned. How often do you drag me to the library? Point taken, she said. Harry helped her mount the broom and climbed on it after her. He pulled her firmly against him. He'd wanted her to feel secure, but at the same time he knew having her soft body pressed against his more intimate parts was going to be pure torture. It almost made him feel bad for laughing at Ron. Almost. "Relax," he said, wrapping his hands around hers. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he assured her once again. "Do you know how many people die in freak broom accidents every day?" Hermione asked as Harry kicked off of the ground, causing the broom to soar up. "And do you know how many people snuff at home warm in their beds? And with the whole wizarding world going to hell, you're more concerned about dying in a broom accident?" he asked. "Since when did you become the highly logical one?" Hermione asked. Harry ignored her question as he made the broom climb higher and higher in the sky. Once they were about 20 feet in the air, he let the stick go level. He knew that her hands were white-knuckled around the broomstick. "Open your eyes, Hermione," he said. "I think it would better for the both of us if I kept them closed," she argued. "I thought you trusted me," he said. "That's not fair," she said, looking over her shoulder at him. "Look out there," he said, nodding to the sun setting in the distance. From their position up in the air, the world below them looked like a fairy tale village made out of ice. The light reflected off of the white ground, causing it to shine like diamonds. Already in the Muggle village, the twinkle Christmas lights were lit up in the village. "It's beautiful," Hermione said. "Are you ready?" Harry asked after he'd given her plenty of time to adjust to being in air and her nerves to settle down. "Ready for what?" she asked. As a reply, Harry made the firebolt shoot forward at full speed. He knew that once he got Hermione up in the air and relaxed, she'd love it. "Harry James Potter, you lied," she squealed with delight. "And you loved it?" He laughed as he made the broom soar higher and the dive back down, causing Hermione to laugh. He brought the broom to the ground as the sun was just sitting over the horizon. "Now you know what you're missing." Hermione's curls were tousled to the extreme, and somewhere over one of the Weasleys' pastures she lost her hat. While she enjoyed being up in the air with Harry, she knew that flying would be something she always shared with him. "I still prefer the library," she teased. "Please like and subscribe."